Hi, I'm Steve Clemens, and I have a question. Has the coronavirus gotten out of hand in China and spread so far and so fast that it just can't be contained? How vulnerable are we to global pandemics? Let's get to the bottom line. By the time we all heard of a mysterious new virus spreading in China, the panic had spread worldwide. With scientists rushing to figure it out, millions of Chinese citizens are under quarantine, factories there are shut down, and the virus has popped up in 26 countries. As we speak, it's killed more than 1,000 people and infected more than 40,000. A whole cruise ship is quarantined off of Yokohama, Japan right now, and people are pleading to get off that ship. So what's next, and how afraid should we be? Fortunately, we have 4 people with us today who have all the answers. Let me start with the 2 scientists. Dr. Lisa Maragakis is a leading researcher of infectious diseases and the Senior Director of Infection Prevention at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Dr. Lina Wen is a physician who teaches public health at George Washington University and is the former health commissioner for the city of Baltimore. And to discuss the wider impact of this story, we have Rob Scott, senior economist at the Economic Policy Institute, and joining us from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, China expert and good friend of mine, Professor Joshua Eisman. So glad to have you all with us today. Lisa, let me just start with you. Can you just kind of give us the dashboard of how we ought to be thinking about the coronavirus and what we're seeing in the world today? Give us the science and then tell us what is unrolling and whether we should be panicked.
Sure. Well, I think we know that pandemic respiratory virus is one of the biggest threats that, from an infectious disease standpoint, that we have to be concerned about. And this is a novel virus, meaning that it is one that hasn't spread in humans before. So that's one of the reasons that it causes a threat. We don't have immunity in the human population to this virus. It started and was first detected in mid-December in China, in Wuhan city. And apparently spread fairly rapidly in that area and then expanded out to the Hubei province.
People think that it came from this wild animal market. Is that right? From bats, baby wolves?
Right.
I mean, a kind of market that I have not experienced, but tell us a little bit about the origins there.
Sure. So initial epidemiologic links were to this live animal market, as you say, and it apparently sells all kinds of live animals. And coronaviruses are known to circulate not only amongst humans, but also animal populations, and particularly bats. And then there are other types of animals that can also carry coronaviruses. So the thought now is that there was probably some intermediary species in that market or in the vicinity that had the coronavirus, and mutations in the virus can then cause it to be able to infect humans.
So this reminds me of a movie, Lisa, where you start out with a small outbreak of 1 person, then it's 10 people, then it's 100, then it's 10,000. And there are New York Times graphics out there that show that. Is this containable at this point?
So this virus has really spread further and wider than some of the other respiratory viruses that are in the same family, the novel coronaviruses that we know as SARS or MERS.
Right.
SARS emerged in
SARS was what, about 20 years ago?
2002,
right.
2003, and that was named for severe acute respiratory syndrome. And that virus killed a lot of people and had a similar origin emerging from animals. And spreading, but it did not spread as far. So in total, it was stopped after there were about 8,000 cases and 800 deaths.
Lina, when you think about this and your experience both looking back at pandemics we've dealt with before, again, what is the DEFCON level as you look?
It's hard to say, and I think it is important to stress to all of our viewers that this is a relatively new virus. It only came to our attention just over a month ago. And so there are a lot of unanswered questions about exactly how infectious it is, how wide, how far, how quick it's going to spread. We're beginning to have some ideas, as Lisa was saying, that it does appear to have infected a lot of people fairly quickly, but we don't know exactly what the extent of the spread is going to be. It does look like there is a lot of community-wide spread already in Hubei province, where this originated in Wuhan city and Hubei, and now in Singapore as well. But we don't know whether our containment efforts in the US and in other parts of the world are going to be effective.
And one of the stories out there is there's a guy who unintentionally spread this. They're calling him a super spreader, who went to the French Alps people that he met in the French Alps who went then to Mallorca and went on to the UK were both infected by this person, who also had gone to France and England. That's just one person who went and was able to generate that. How many, I mean, I know you have experience of sort of looking at these questions, particularly with Baltimore, and I also know there's the annual influenza, which also hits a lot of people. So one part of this is how sensationalized should this coronavirus be compared to the incidence of the average flu, which affects millions of people each year?
So I think it depends on where you are. Right now in China, the novel coronavirus is a big issue. It's infecting tens of thousands of people. The number of cases is rising rapidly. It really needs to be contained in China. It's a big concern. In the US, at this very moment, the risk of coronavirus is extremely low. There have been, 12 cases or so of people in America who've been diagnosed with coronavirus, and you compare that to the 18 million people who have been diagnosed with influenza just this season, and the tens of thousands who get killed every flu season from influenza in the US. So I think it is important for us to keep that in perspective, that the risk to the average American right now is very low, but this is an important virus, an important epidemic to keep abreast of and aware of from the national and international perspective.
Lena, what would you do if you were the mayor of Wuhan, China, or the head of city health in Wuhan, China? What would you do?
I mean, China has taken some extraordinary measures, and I would argue late. It does appear, based on the reports, that there was lack of transparency initially in reporting the new virus, lack of transparency to the point of even censoring physicians who are trying to warn their fellow health professionals about this emerging virus. And now there's this unprecedented quarantine affecting almost 60 million people.
Right.
Now, I don't know that that right now this type of aggressive approach is the right approach. But it does appear that the Chinese government has recognized the seriousness of this epidemic, and I think what I would do
was it WHO late?
Hard to say at that time.
But when you look at it, have we become so complacent about these things that now you look at the WHO did not take this seriously on the front end, and now they are, but look what's happened. I mean, I think it raises the question. I mean, I think, frankly, the importance of coronavirus today is not just coronavirus today, it's how we deal with pandemics in general. So did the WHO screw up?
I think it's more the Chinese government should have been transparent from the very beginning about what they knew and to have allowed international help in the assistance of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the assistance of the World Health Organization. There's a lot in looking back that had they been allowed in, they could have gotten a lot more information that could have curtailed the epidemic instead of where we are now.
Lisa, you're nodding.
Transparency.
I am nodding. I think that we have heard in recent days that there was a delay in accepting assistance, international assistance from the WHO, from the Centers for Disease Control, from the United States, and others who can assist. And anytime a country is dealing with this kind of an outbreak, you really need all the help that you can get.
Josh, let me jump to you. You know China well and the decision making in China. And I think that the question is, what do you think when it comes to Chinese leadership decisions either exacerbated or acted smartly with relation? Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, perhaps, that maybe they're doing whatever can be done. But how do you read it as an expert on Chinese decision making?
Well, thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here with you. I would agree with the other panelists at this point. If you're the mayor of Wuhan, your primary question is, what does the center want me to do? Which is a strange thing to be thinking in the middle of an epidemic. So the problem here I find to be primarily political, and that is the opacity of the Chinese state. Viruses, disease, fear, rumors, these things thrive in opacity, and the Chinese state is famous for that. So we find ourselves in a situation where the information is in doubt, where rumors are rampant. It is not the right political climate to handle an epidemic, and I would completely agree with the other panelists on this. And so the question then becomes, is the Communist Party of China, which leads China, capable of evolving its governance in such a way that allows for the proper treatment of these kinds of things? Or is this a prelude to a further problem? Because we shouldn't forget that the swine flu epidemic has been ravaging China for almost a year now, and it's been been overshadowed now by this epidemic, but that and the problems in responding to swine flu are reflected exactly in what we're seeing now with regard to humans. So it's not surprising for those of us who study Chinese politics that there has been a lack of transparency on this issue. And I guess, now we've got the WHO on the ground, at least in China. I don't think they're even been allowed into Wuhan yet. But this goes to the sensitivity of the Chinese leadership in accepting foreign assistance and foreign guidance on things which they have deemed their internal affairs. And so as long as we've got politicians rather than doctors leading this effort, I'm concerned about the information coming out, and I'm concerned about our ability to respond properly to this epidemic.
Josh, I want to play for my panel and you a clip from Senator Tom Cotton on the Chinese government and the virus.
China is still lying about all of this. They've been lying about it from the very beginning, and you don't need their history of lying about SARS in 2003, though it is relevant here. You just have to see what's happened over the last 2 months.
Josh, do you believe the Chinese government was lying from the outset?
I think maybe lying isn't the right word. They were perhaps trying to control the story. They were trying to control it from a propaganda perspective, such that it did not reflect the party in a bad light. They didn't want the rumors to fly, and so they tried to control the story and manipulate it. But in doing so, as we see from the death of Dr. Li and the 5 million people who are said to have left Wuhan during the period where nothing was done or nothing major was done. Yeah, I think this is a problem. I have to agree with the senator on these issues. This is a lack of transparency, and it's a political leadership which is placing politics above the health of the Chinese people. And so until the Chinese people's health becomes the #1 priority, not controlling the party, not the image of Xi Jinping, but simple health concerns, I don't think we're going to see the kind of transparency we need. And I think this is a problem around the world. And of course, we have health experts on the panel who could speak to exactly what that problem is. But, you had mentioned a moment ago this individual who flew to France, and all of this time seems to have been wasted while the propagandists were thinking of the best story and the best line to tell. So there's no doubt that there's been a problem here. And the question is, from SARS in 2002 to swine flu over the last 2 years to this epidemic, are we now seeing a pattern that is directly related to governance that we need to be concerned about? And how does that reflect on China's image around the world, especially among those developing countries, those Belt and Road countries that China is trying to woo? Right. I think that this brings into question and calls into question their model of governance.
How fragile or not fragile is the position of Xi Jinping, members of the State Council in this? Are they feeling political heat that's consequential from this, from their own public, or not?
I would say not. I guess my view on this is that the Chinese state's security state apparatus is fully capable of even locking down 60 million people, and that the old thinking that we used to have about mandates of heaven is no longer relevant in this current security and technological climate. So my sense is that Xi Jinping and the leadership may actually gain in terms of political consolidation of power from this. I just don't see a way that this destabilizes the Communist Party of China. And I think those concerns are overblown. And I think we shouldn't be Chicken Little with regard to the political implications of this, because I can see it just as easily coming to resounding to the benefit of the party's desire to enhance its control as I can actually harming them. And on the economic side, I guess I'll leave that for now. But politically speaking, this could cut either way, and I would urge people not to jump to conclusions on that.
Rob, you studied the SARS virus and the economic fallout from that, yes. Whether it was there or not. And I'd ask you first, from your knowledge of looking at SARS, what insights should we gain from that in terms of looking at what the economic implications today are from the coronavirus?
I'd like to make 2 points in that regard. First, if you step back from the 30 or 50,000 foot level and think about the impact of this epidemic over 6 months or a year, what we see is it's very hard to detect an economic impact. In the SARS case, there was almost no change in the rate of growth of China's GDP and its unemployment. Its trade surplus continued to grow in 2003 during the epidemic, and for the next 7 or 8 years until the Great Recession began in 2008 and 2009. So no economic impact. Even in Japan, I've also looked at the Fukushima Daiichi reactor disaster, which was much more fundamental to Japan's economy. In that case, it did knock the Japanese economy back for a year or two. There was a downturn in output.
And they raised the cost of energy,
and they raised, well,
which the public accepted. I mean, I know there was a 15% rise in the cost of energy in Japan after Fukushima.
Exactly, but there's also a supply constraint. They didn't have enough, and so that limited their ability to produce exports. And as a result, their trade surplus shrank for 2 or 3 years. But in the end...
So you're saying in the macro sense, no.
In the macro sense,
But I know
no.
lots of people in the micro sense that are making the argument. I know a lot of folks that right now that are supporting Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and they are out tweeting today about their worry that we have structural dependence on Chinese producers, Chinese supply lines, essentially supply chains, for critical materials that might be needed in a health crisis, like masks.
Well, that's
3M Corporation in Minneapolis makes these masks, and some they make here, but a lot they make abroad. And there is this worry that we become so intertwined with the Chinese economy and supply chains elsewhere in the world that there's now a structural dependence that we can't extract ourselves. And when it comes to who gets surgical masks, if they matter, well, I don't know what they call health masks. What do we call them, Lisa?
Surgical masks.
Surgical masks.
Or respirators.
Respirator masks. Right. That we don't have what we need if this were to spread at the same scale and rate in the United States, and China has significantly more.
Exactly, and I think this is a concern. I mean, you take, for example, the auto industry. China has become increasingly integrated in the auto parts industry and are part of a huge global supply chain producing tens of millions of vehicles a year, and that's going to be interrupted. They've already shut down parts plants. I know that in electronics, the Foxconn plants have been shut down, so that's going to affect Apple. So there are going to be disruptions. The question is, can, over the course of 3 months or 6 months, can production adjust? I suspect it will. Plants will be double and triple shifted. Output will be made up by the end of the year. But I think it illustrates the second point, which you do suggest. We're dealing with a different kind of an institution here, as Josh said. It's a state that acts first and foremost to protect its own interest, not to manage the economy in the best possible way, and that has both health and economic implications. And I think there's a real cost a hidden cost that we're now dealing with of the decision to globalize the production system, and in particular to move so much of our supply chain production to China. Right. And we're now extremely vulnerable to that, and I think this illustrates that problem.
Lisa and Lena, let me ask you a question about the, well, Josh wanted to jump in. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to jump in right on that point. During the Trump administration, we've seen a movement of supplies back into Southeast Asia. And if you look at where the American trade deficit is, it's increasingly, again, with other countries. It's falling with China, but it's increasing with other countries in the region. So one could argue that this is going to catalyze that process of moving supply lines out of China. So a process that has already begun is now being catalyzed even further. And I would be more pessimistic than the previous guest with regard to the effect on the economy, because this is not the China of 2002, 2003, the economic juggernaut. This is an economy which has seen some problems in the last few years, and it has demographic problems that are only getting worse over time. So I'm concerned about a perfect storm where this catalyzes the movement of supply lines outside of China. It increases and catalyzes these demographic problems, and really produces a long-term slowing of growth within the Chinese economy. So I'm a bit more concerned about the long-term effects of this, because it's compounded by other economic and demographic aspects, which I think make it more concerning than in 2002, 2003.
Thank you for that. Lisa and Lena, let me ask you a question about the vulnerability that we have systemically to these kinds of situations. It's raised the question of how prepared we are for the next virus from wherever it may come. I mean, you think of Zika, you think of Ebola, you think of others that are out there, but I know, for instance, Dr. Tony Fauci, a friend of mine from NIH, is often talking about invisible killers and our lack of preparedness. And so how would, Lena, how would you look at this question of preparedness and what we should be doing, not only just for coronavirus today, but the next thing coming down the pike that could be even have not a 2% death rate, but have a 20% death rate?
There's a saying in public health that public health saved your life today, you just don't know it. That public health is all about preparedness and preventing outbreaks to the point that we are successful when nothing happens.
Right.
And coronavirus and Ebola and all these other cases, that's when there is an outbreak. And we're seeing what happens when that contagion is not controlled and contained in the first place. So I think we have come a long way. The public health infrastructure is better overall, certainly in the US, than it was 10, 20 years ago. But we are facing a lot of deficits, primarily when it comes to funding.
Right.
The public health workforce as a whole has been declining in the last 20 years. The amount that's given to local public health, which is the first responders, the people who are on the front lines, are people who are the local health providers and public health officials. The amount given for local public health has declined by 30% since 2003. And I am
So you're not
concerned.
optimistic about this in the future? I don't feel optimism coming across the table here.
I think we have great experts who do this work every single day, but what happens is that because of the lack of funding, when there is a new outbreak, we end up pulling funding from existing disease, from existing issues, and it's robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Right. Lisa, I want to just get your sense real quick.
Sure, I guess I'm a little bit
vulnerability.
more optimistic. I do see the problems and we definitely need funding, but I think that some of the infectious disease threats that we've seen over the last decade or so have reminded us on a regular basis of the need for the preparedness that Lena was alluding to. And so I think that we are in some ways in a better position. Information, when it can come, and that's the important piece that we were discussing earlier about transparency and information. Information sharing leads to more rapid development of vaccines and therapeutics, and the epidemiology information can help preparedness. Right now, we're desperate to know, for instance, if this virus is transmitted by large droplets that would be stopped by a regular surgical mask, or if it is by the airborne route, for which we need respirators.
All right, Robin, our final couple of minutes, I want to get your thoughts on whatever you're about to say, but I also want to just know, as an economist and sort of looking at containment and strategy, what are your insights?
Yeah, quick point, 2 points. It's ironic that the White House 2 years ago, I think, shut down the Office of Pandemics. I mean, we need the resources to respond to these things. Economically, I think, for me, I think this incident forces us to re-examine the benefits of having these distributed supply chains. One way to address that, I think, is to rebalance global trade, reduce some of these huge surpluses China has, pull it back. The simplest way to do that is to realign the dollar, bring it down, make us more competitive.
Josh, I want to get your insights from your thoughts on essentially the geostrategic dimensions of this. What can be done to basically move the world to a healthier position, a healthier situation with China, dealing with, because what happens in China doesn't stay in China.
No, it doesn't. And, we have this U.S.-China relationship right now, which is deeply fraught. And the word decoupling is being brought up on both sides. And so this exacerbates and accelerates that decoupling. Educational programs, tourism, business, all of these things are being affected. And so my concern is geopolitically, this is exacerbating this pull apart of our two countries. And so what does that mean geopolitically when we've got issues to work on together, I think is a big question going forward. So I see the implications of this just kind of exploding into almost all aspects of the bilateral relationship. So I think that this is a primary concern for us, especially as we see the Chinese economy slowing, and that's a major engine of growth. And if we look at the developing world as well, we see China as a relationship with these developing countries more and more at the center. So we need to, I think, be really cognizant of the geopolitical effects of this.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. We're going to have to leave it there today. I thank you all for being with us today. Infectious disease expert Dr. Lisa Maragakis, public health expert Dr. Lena Wen, economist Rob Scott, and the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, Professor Joshua Eisenman. So what's the bottom line? You know, sometimes it's not about the bottom line. It's about human life and about heroes. I want to dedicate the final moments of my show to Dr. Li Wenliang, a real hero who tried to save his fellow citizens and warn the world of this virus.